We'll get started then. Welcome, everybody. I'm Wendy Ferber, the TSTI liaison to the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL. We're so glad that so many of you joined us for this. It's a very difficult time for Israel, for Jews, and for us as a community. We're so glad that we're able to provide this forum to learn more and to ask questions. We want to welcome this evening David White, who is the Associate Regional Director of Jewish Outreach for the New York, New Jersey region at the ADL, as well as our beloved Rabbi Cohen. The format tonight is that Rabbi Cohen and David will be discussing the state of anti-Semitism before and after October 7th and what we can do to help combat it. This will be for approximately 45 minutes. After that, we will answer questions. Please feel free to submit questions via the chat function throughout the evening, but please keep in mind that we have a very large audience, so we will do our best to combine and address as many questions as possible. If you would like more ways to discuss this subject and take action, we will be providing a link to our newly formed Slack channel, and any Temple member can join to read content, start conversations, and share action steps about what's going on right now. We will also be posting a document with tons of super easy action steps for you to take in the upcoming TSTI today. This document will also be posted on the Slack channel. Thanks, and without further delay, welcome David White and Rabbi Cohen.
Thank you.
Wendy and Tracy, thank you for putting this all together and for doing everything. You, Wendy, thank you for being our TSTI liaison to ADL, a role that was important when you accepted it, but has become even more significant in the last weeks, for sure. So thank you for doing what you're doing. And David, it's always a privilege to see you. And I know how busy you are. I know how busy all of you at ADL are right now. And I just really am grateful to you for making the time to be here this evening and to talk with us and to be starting this conversation as we continue to work together to figure out where we're going, where we are, where we're going, and how we get there together. Because more than anything right now, it is our working together as a community, locally and an extended family, that is going to be key to our being able to continue doing what we know that we need to do and hopefully addressing this issue. So let me just jump right in, if I may. I had the opportunity about a week and a half ago to visit with our local high school Jewish student group. And I spent about an hour and a half speaking with about 75 of our teens, 75 teens in one room for an hour and a half, and they were all listening to each other. It was really quite beautiful and heartbreaking, but really quite something. And since some people don't like asking questions out loud, we at the very beginning passed out cards to everybody and invited those who preferred to write out their questions to write out their questions. And what was really striking to me was that the very first card I got back was a question about the ADL from a teenager. And so I'm sure that many of the people, if not all, are familiar with the ADL on this call and its work, but I don't want to assume that universally. So as a jump-in point, if you can just talk briefly about what is the ADL, what's its work, why does it exist, and what do you do? And if I can add to that, and what do you do now that might be different than you did 8 weeks ago?
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you again, really, for having me. Always a pleasure to be able to have this forum to be able to speak on these issues, which I think are now more important than ever. So we were founded in 1913 following a very horrific incident in Atlanta, where a Jewish man was what we believe, and he was now been vindicted of this crime, falsely convicted of murdering a young woman. And when this man named Leo Frank, and I'm not sure any of you saw a beautifully done Broadway show called Parade, which was about this. Leo Frank was convicted. He was initially sentenced to death, and then his sentence was commuted to life in prison. While he was in prison, he was kidnapped and lynched by a vicious mob. And the feeling after of our founders was there was no organization. The government was not protecting him. The justice system was not protecting him, and the community was not protecting him. So there was a need for an organization that was going to protect Jews like Leo from not being becoming another issue and another statistic and another horrific incident purely because he was Jewish. So we were founded on the mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people, but also to secure fair treatment for all, because hate is hate. And when one group is targeted, it's not usually ending with that group being the only group that is targeted. So today, 100 plus years later, we still do that work. The bulk of our work is responding directly to anti-Semitic incidents that come through our incident portal, through individuals on the ground. We have 25 regions across the country that are meant to directly respond to local incidents. Our national office is in New York, but we need that local response so that people can feel like we can respond to these incidents on the ground. So also, we have education programs. We work with hundreds of schools across the country, providing anti-bias training to them through our A World of Difference program, through our No Place for Hate programs. We have our Center on Extremism, which dives very deeply into researching both extremist trends on the right and the left, what these trends look like, who the players are, the groups are, but also really diving deep into what sites they use, what social media sites they use, how they're getting their information across, what dog whistles they might use. So not necessarily overt racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic things, but what are the things that they're saying that on the surface people may not understand, but what they're saying is actually something much more heinous. Can give an example to the extent of their work. The Buffalo shooting happened, May of 2022. Our team was able to find the manifesto of the shooting before the FBI was able to, and was able to provide that information to them so that they understood what the motive was of the shooter was, and what things like the Great Replacement theory are driving people to commit these heinous crimes. We also have a Center for Technology and Society that look at trends on social media, what social media companies are doing or not doing to stop hate and misinformation on their platforms. They release a report card every year of each of the sites, the main sites, X, formerly Twitter, Google, Facebook, Instagram. And unfortunately, as we see over and over again, these sites do not uphold their own terms of service. And so they provide guidance in terms of how to legislate properly, what these companies can be doing more properly. And we also have our Center for Anti-Semitic Research, which publishes different reports about anti-Semitic attitudes in the country. So not just what people are doing, but also what people are thinking. And what we found this year especially was we did a survey of 6 different anti-Semitic tropes. And what we found was 60% of people in this country uphold at least one of those stereotypes, and 18% uphold 5 or more, which is a really astounding number when you think about it and break it down. And to respond to your final point, how have things changed? So we're mostly primarily an advocacy organization. We will advocate for people in the workplace. We will advocate for students in school. We will advocate for organizations that may be targeted. But one of the things that we've now done that has changed has become much more active in the legal field, particularly on college campuses. One of the things that we're doing now is we established a call hotline. We partnered with the Brandeis Center and a very prominent law firm to provide pro bono legal help for students and faculty who are not being protected on their campuses and are not being given the proper protections that other groups may, especially as October 7th and post October 7th, we've seen a absolute massive rise in anti-Semitism. So we are playing a much more active role in the legal field in ways that we did not pre-October 7th.
So I want to follow up, if I may, and ask you to just talk a little bit about the portal, which we have actually had to direct multiple people in our congregation to already in the last 2 months. And I don't want to pass by that without you just talking a little bit more about it and how important it is that if anybody sees or experiences something, that they make use of it immediately. Once they're safe, once they've reported to law enforcement, step number 3 should be actually going to this portal, in my opinion. Can you just talk a little bit more about it so everybody's aware of that?
two ways that you can report incidents to the ADL. It's our regular portal, which is adl.org/report incidents. So if you think that you've experienced an incident, whether it be, someone yelling something to you, if you see the anti-Semitic graffiti somewhere, if you believe you're being discriminated at work, if you have been, God forbid, assaulted and you believe it was hate motivated, we then, our team on the ground will respond directly and advocate for you. But the new portal that we have, which is legal-protection.org, is if, for schools, if you believe that there is your schools, your administration, your faculty are not protecting students, staff in ways that, they are legally required to do, you now can fill out this portal, and we will then have a pro bono attorney meet with you and discuss your legal options. Because what we're seeing now is it's not just about advocating. In some ways, people actually need legal protection, because as we're seeing, and it's unfortunately primarily on college campuses, schools are far too often hiding behind freedom of speech and believing that any speech is protected speech, which we're finding very quickly is not the case. And so you need to be able to be protected, and you need to know your legal options as well. And if the school is not going to protect you, we're not afraid anymore to take this to court.
Amen to that. And I should point out, it was just actually slacked me just for everyone to be aware that 42 attorneys general, including our own, just sued Meta for harms to youth on Instagram, Facebook. So, and I'm going to assume that ADL has been working with them, but it's now we're doing things differently, and it's not a matter of trying to outshout people, but it's trying to actually look and to use the legitimate legal mechanisms that are necessary to create the safe spaces that everybody deserves. So we've seen, we were monitoring an uptick in Jew hatred and anti-Semitic incidents for quite a while now. And we've seen a spike in it every time Israel has responded to Hamas missiles and terrorism. I remember 2014, there was an example of that. A couple of years ago, there were examples of that. But I don't think we've ever seen as rapid and universal a spike in anti-Jewish sentiment as we're seeing now. And we've never seen social media weaponized against Israel and against our community to the extent that we currently do. Can you give us some insight into the state of anti-Semitism today, if you will? What are those who deal with this on a day-to-day basis seeing, and how has that transformed? If it has transformed, how has that transformed in the last 2 months since October 7th?
So it's a good question. So every year, ADL comes out with our annual report, our audit of anti-Semitic incidents. So in 2022, we saw 3,600 incidents of anti-Semitism across the country, which was the highest that we have seen so far on record. And the way we collect this data is we put it into 4 different categories. So it's vandalism, assault, harassment, and flyer distribution. So if an extremist group like the Goyim Defense League flyers a town or a community. So we, 3,600 incidents, a lot. And New York and New Jersey, unfortunately, were first and third in terms of those incidents, making up, almost a quarter of the incidents across the country in 2 states.
Can you repeat
Since
that? I think
October
that's really important. In nice, progressive, liberal tri-state area. Can you say that number again?
We're almost in 2 states, make up a quarter of all anti-Semitic incidents, which is really important to understand. I think one of the things that we see is that, states with more Jews tend to unfortunately have more of these incidents. The top 4 states always are New York, New Jersey, California, and Florida, which happen to be the 4 states with the largest population of Jews. But that's not the only reason why this happens. It's not, to say that just because there are more Jews, there are more anti-Semitic incidents is not the only reason we can point to. It's polarization, it's social media and the rise in hatred on these sites. It's the lack of protection that Jews feel like we have in terms of legal protections. So it's a lot of different reasons why, but unfortunately we do see that in areas with more Jews, there is unfortunately more anti-Semitism, which, you know, in any community with a certain demographic, we unfortunately see a larger amount of hate towards that group. It just is unfortunately kind of what we're seeing in terms of the numbers across the board. Post October 7th, we've seen 1,400 recorded incidents of anti-Semitism. 1,400 in a almost 2-month span. When you think about the fact that 3,600 incidents we recorded in all of 2022, that is a 316% increase in the same time period that we saw last year. It is massive. And to kind of put it into perspective of what we saw in 2021, there was a 180% increase in 2021. So massive. But this is the largest spike that we have ever seen in a 2-month period. And it is vastly, vastly due to anti-Israel rhetoric. That's not to say that we are not seeing a rise in right-wing anti-Semitism too. I'm sure everyone saw what happened in Wisconsin a couple weeks ago, where a group of neo-Nazis right by the campus marched with Nazi flags and yelled incredibly horrific anti-Semitic things. And we were not at all surprised that right-wing neo-Nazi white supremacist groups were going to capitalize on the rise in anti-Semitism. But make no mistake here, this is a direct response to what is happening in Israel. And this is anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism at its finest, which, Jonathan, if you've seen him speak on the news, anywhere else, you will see that he has drawn the line that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And there is no more clear a correlation than what we're seeing in the rise in anti-Semitism right now because of what's going on in Israel and the ability for people to collectively blame the Jewish community for whatever happens overseas. And we unfortunately see it every time, but this is something very new.
And I will point out that we saw demonstrations starting not just in Europe, but in the streets of America and on the campuses in America on October 7th and October
Correct.
8th, which was before Israel began its retaliation. So this outburst of hatred and anger and ugliness predates Israel's response to the terror attack, which speaks volumes as well. One of the signs that I saw at the DC rally a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, whenever that was, I've lost track of time, the sign said, the extreme left and the extreme right meet in anti-Semitism. Which I do believe is true. It's a circle. It's not a line. One of the most troubling aspects of this current spike in Jew hatred, I think, has been the proliferation and the open use of anti-Semitic tropes and memes. And oftentimes, you reference this, they're being shared and amplified by people who don't fully understand what they're sharing and embracing. Although, to be clear, I happen to believe that ignorance isn't an excuse, and at this point, any ignorance is willful ignorance. We're 2 months in, it's willful ignorance if people are still ignorant. But I'm just wondering if you can, so that we can all be more aware of what to look for, because sometimes it's very, very obvious, and sometimes it's a little more subtle, although they don't really care about the subtlety anymore. Just what are some of the more common anti-Semitic tropes that we're seeing right now, and how are we seeing them manifest, and what should we be on the lookout? And the bonus question, when we see people using them, how and when should we engage?
So, I think what we've seen is a lot of these tropes have been around for a long time. They're just kind of packaged a little differently. So I would say, the biggest thing that we're seeing is the use of Zionism instead of Jews. Zionists control X, or the Zionist lobby is controlling our government. Replace that with Jew, and it's the same thing. What I would say in terms of anti-Israel rhetoric that we're seeing that is incredibly problematic and, is not what any of us would consider protected speech is the use of certain things like the term "from the river to the sea." So for anyone who is not aware of this chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," is from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be free of Israel. which is a call for ethnic cleansing. There is no other way to describe it. That is what it's called, because if you ask anyone who says that and is overtly saying that, so where do the Jews go? I don't care. Doesn't matter. They're gone. That is a call for ethnic cleansing. There's no other way around it. Another thing that we're seeing that is incredibly problematic is the calls for intifada and to globalize the intifada. So for anyone who is not aware of the intifada, it was a collective events. There were two. The first intifada was in the late 90s, and the second intifada was in 2002. And it was a violent uprising, including terrorist attacks, suicide bombs that killed thousands of Israelis. And what people will say now is it's a revolution, it's freedom of Palestinian. No, the Intifada was a violent uprising that killed thousands of Israelis. So when people say that, they're calling for violence. And to say globalizing the Intifada means targeting Jews all over the world, not just Israel. So these are the ways that anti-Zionists are now completely unmasked in terms of their rhetoric. It's violent, it's hateful, and it is creating an environment for Jews in public and private spaces to feel not only unwelcome, but to feel actively unsafe. And I think another one that we're seeing right now, and I think I alluded to it a little bit, was this idea of control. The ideas of Jews' control and Jewish power has been something that is not at all new to us. It is something that Hitler used as a catalyst for the Holocaust, of the idea that Jews had too much power and had too much influence around the world, and therefore they're a problem and need to be dealt with. That is something we're seeing now, and it's something that we're still seeing in the terms of people may not be saying Jews, although we have seen a number of occasions where people have just said Jews, but they're using the term Zionist to mask and say, no, we don't mean all Jews. We just mean Zionists. But when you look at the numbers, 80% of Jews in this country have a connection to Israel and identify as Zionists. So I don't know what else you're going to say besides, if you're talking about Zionists have too much power, we need to get rid of Zionists, you're talking about 80% of the Jewish population around the world. And so I think, and the second part of your question is kind of how to engage. So I think the first thing that I tell people is to never put yourself in a situation where you feel like you are in danger. I know there is always this frustration and anger and wanting to collectively prove people wrong. I unfortunately think there are certain people out there, when they're using these tropes, they understand exactly what they mean, and there is no changing thoughts and minds. But some of these rallies and some of these things have become rather aggressive and violent, and just be careful when you see these things. You know, you can always use your power of your voice, but also just your safety is more important than anything else. On social media, report. People don't want to lose their social media accounts. And what we are seeing, and it's slow, is that social media companies are finally kind of understanding what is the hateful rhetoric. The question is, are they actually going to utilize this rhetoric and make sure that people are not platformed? That's yet to be seen. But Jonathan did have a long conversation with Elon Musk on Friday, where he made it very clear that there are certain things that are being said that are incredibly problematic, which actually prompted Elon to come out and make it very clear what is hateful speech when it comes to this. He specifically said intifada. He specifically discussed from the river to the sea, because it was really, really, really important that those things were made clear. You know, if you see things on the street, you see problematic speech, you see aggression, report it to the police. It may not be that everything you're seeing is a crime, but every single thing is reported and is on record, so that they know that certain things are being said and certain things are being done. So they have a paper trail. So when things do get worse and escalate, they have evidence to support this. Obviously reported to the ADL. We liaison with law enforcement, with public officials, with CEOs of companies all the time. And it's important for us to be able to engage as well and provide guidance to people who really need it. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but I think those are some of the ways.
It's an important answer. It was an important answer. You know, one of the things that I said to the high school students when I was with them is I said, look, because they asked a question about engaging, and I said, look, number one, You don't have to engage.
Yeah,
Right? If you, as you said, if you're uncomfortable, if you feel unsafe, don't engage, or you don't have to engage in that moment. I said, but if you are going to engage, be prepared to make the investment to engage, because it's never one conversation. It's never one interaction. If you're not ready to engage multiple times with that individual, with that group, then don't do it at all, because it's not a one and done. None of this is a one and done right now. But as you said, and I want to reiterate it, it's everyone's safety comes first. Has to
and
come
I think
first.
one more thing I would add is, social media has become a space where people really want to engage and want to, counter the negative points being made. It's also okay to disengage on social media as well. People are gonna say things that they wouldn't normally say in person because they're able to hide behind a screen. Unfortunately, you're not gonna always change hearts and minds on these things. And what it may do is just may frustrate you and make you angry and may just amplify your 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 sadness around these topics. Sometimes it is okay, like Rabbi, you said, to just disengage.
Also keep in mind, everyone you're engaging with on social media may not actually be a human being. You may be dealing with bots, you may be dealing with AI. There are initially after October 7th, there was a whole campaign that was ramped up immediately, and it's taken a long time for the responses now against this from the Jewish community and those aligned with us to actually respond and to flood the response to that. They were ready to do that, and a lot of those were not actually human beings. So let's go back to the security issue. I'm sorry, you were going to say, David, please.
There are a lot of bots in these sites. You're absolutely correct.
And in fact, the amount of hate that we're seeing online may not actually reflect the proportions of hate. It's not reality. It's not reality, but it's also something we have to deal with, because it does create an environment that allows a lot of this ugliness to happen and spill over into violence at times. So let's talk about violence and security. So our congregation went to armed security actually a few years before the Tree of Life attack, before it. 2 years ago, as we saw our security needs rapidly expanding, we created a security endowment. And at the time, we thought that we could meet our security needs for 15 or so years based upon what we raised at the time. In the last year, we've seen the security needs continue to rise. We now find ourselves needing to actually raise more than double what we initially raised over the next year or two for the security. And we're just one suburban congregation in a town whose law enforcement has our backs more than any law enforcement, more than I could ever ask for. Our law enforcement is amazing in our town. Can you speak about the institutional impact you're seeing across the board of this rise in anti-Jewish sentiment, and which institutions are most greatly impacted, and how has the way in which we need to address these security challenges, has that changed since October 7th, or just become more important?
So I don't think it's changed. I unfortunately think that even, the Tree of Life shooting, I think, was the catalyst that really changed everything. I think the understanding that houses of worship needed to be protected clear. And I am so thankful that, your state and many others, along with the federal government, are continuing to add more and more funding to the federal security grants that houses of worship are able to receive, because it is so imperative. What we are unfortunately seeing, and we're seeing this at a time where, unfortunately, I'm sure it comes to no surprise, is that there has been a rise in vandalism of synagogues. We had a synagogue that was incredibly progressive, that is, champions the rights of Palestinians, be targeted with anti-Semitic graffiti. And we've seen that in a variety of other institutions. We've also unfortunately seen, I don't know if you all remember, that this summer we had a variety of bomb threats and swattings that happened at houses of worship all over the country. We unfortunately over the last few weeks have seen an uptick in that as well. So houses of worship are something that we are always incredibly mindful of and have a much more watchful eye on when things like this happen, and is why, Jonathan, when we had, we're advocating for the aid package to Israel, we also in that made a request for an additional $500 million for the national security grants, because the realization that houses of worship needed to be even more protected at this time was made incredibly apparent even before we saw incidents, but then we saw incidents of anti-Semitism happen, and it just made our case even more abundantly clear. You know, what we're also seeing is a need for college campuses to really readjust their security as well, and how they allow certain types of public rhetoric and forums to be addressed. You know, as you said, we saw protests on campuses October 7th. We saw them happen right away. And it wasn't just peaceful, we're going to go through and, you know, we're advocating for the rights of Palestinians. No, it was violent rhetoric. We saw at campuses like Cooper Union, where students had to be locked in the library because they had a mob coming at them, chanting aggressive things, banging on the doors, not knowing what would happen if that mob of students entered the building. You know, we're seeing these groups occupy libraries, buildings, creating not only, you know, uncomfortable environments, but actively hostile environments, to the point where these administrations need to readjust what they're allowing in terms of public forums and protests, but also the need for added security at all of these formats, which, thank God, we've seen it happen right away, where they're still allowing protests, but they're making it very clear what type of rhetoric is allowed, what you're allowed to do in these forums, and are making sure that there's security there so that students are able to not have to be in these spaces and feel like they're alone. We're also seeing that schools are now willing to suspend students and student groups if they violate these protocols. Brandeis, Columbia have suspended their Students for Justice in Palestine chapters and their Jewish Voice for Peace chapters because they are continuing to violate the rules. And one of the things that we're actually recommending schools do, and we sent a letter to 200 presidents a few weeks ago, asking that they investigate certain student groups for how they're getting their funding and how they're engaging. If they're violating federal law, they're violating state law, if they're violating their code of conduct, and if they're not willing to do what's right, we'll take you to court. Because if you are willfully allowing student groups, professors, students themselves to violate laws and your own code of conduct, and you're doing nothing about it, then Title VI complaints are there. Lawsuits are there. There are avenues that ourselves, other organizations, individuals can take to make sure that the schools are held accountable. Because at this point, as you said, we're 2 months in, ignorance is not it's not an excuse anymore. And administrations and others saying, sorry, we don't know what to do at this point, is not an answer.
I'm into that. Before I go to my final question, the survey came out today. We were touching on this before we let everyone in. Can you just talk about that? Because it really does drive home the reality of what we're dealing with. And that leads to the last question I'm going to ask.
So we have done now 2 surveys with Hillel International, which surveys Jewish students on campus, Jewish students and non-Jewish students on campus, about what they see as the problems in terms of anti-Semitism and hate. What we found was, before October 7th, you had about 42% of the Jewish population on campus surveyed saying that they did not feel safe on campus. Post October 7th, you had 66% of Jewish students surveyed saying that they did not feel safe. Not just that they didn't feel welcome, but they feel unsafe. We also have seen 200 incidents. These are incidents that have been vetted, that we have investigated, and we have deemed to be anti-Semitism in 2 months. 200. To put that into perspective, the last time we did this survey, in the same amount of time, we saw 20. This is a really massive problem. And it's now on not just the administration, but the government, attorney generals, others, to be investigating these, especially for public institutions that are taking tax money and have an obligation to protect all students. And it feels like right now, Jewish students, for whatever reason, are not seen as a class worth protecting. And it is an absolute problem. And I will send this as part of the action items after the fact. I recommend everyone look at this survey because the numbers are startling, but they need to be seen by everyone.
Right. So here's my final question before we open up to some of the questions from people who are here. The $1 million shekel question. we know the reality we're dealing with right now. I think a lot of us are still shocked by it. We saw it upticking, but the numbers and the energy behind it is still shocking to a lot of us. We know that once the genie is out of the bottle, it is hard to get back into the bottle, if possible at all. So we need to manage and deal with the current challenges, at least for the foreseeable future. What can communities like ours do to help address this toxic spread of hate? What can we do? Because we're not a community that just wants to sit on Zoom and listen to you, as excellent as you are, and I appreciate your being here. This is a community that wants to do things. What should we be doing right now?
So the first thing I would suggest is always report. And if you're not sure that you've seen an incident online, in public, whatever, report. If you think it's a crime, report it to the police. As I said before, even if you don't necessarily think it's a crime, police departments have to take reports. So report it to the police, report it to us. It's not only important for us to have this data just for our numbers, but it's important for us to be able to help the community and for us to be able to, when speaking with elected officials and speaking with law enforcement, for us to really have a full picture. So that's one thing you can do. The second thing I would strongly suggest is, and this is really especially for parents, right now, we are seeing an absolute toxic spread of hate on social media. And, you know, I would never say that you should be policing what your kids see, but you should be knowing the things that your kids are seeing online, especially in this moment. You know, we are seeing horrific things come out from Israel. We're seeing awful things that you can't unsee. And kids don't necessarily need to be seeing all of this. And they're also seeing a vast amount of misinformation. It's really astounding. It's scary. And, you know, because kids are getting so much of their information from social media, it's not necessarily that we're able to say to them, you know, what you're seeing is wrong. And we just want to make sure that they're not getting false information that is then scaring them and making them think that certain things, Israel, Jews, others, are the problem here. It's important to know all of the facts here. The third thing I would suggest, and this is something that I think we as a Jewish community don't always do, is educate yourself on what's going on in Israel. You know, we don't necessarily do that piece as much, but Stand With Us and other organizations have a vast amount of resources on the history of Israel. What is going on? What is the real truth here? It's important for us to be educated on these topics because Lord knows we're seeing so much misinformation come out about this. We need to be able to fight back with our knowledge. I would continue to share pro-Israel things on your social media accounts. Before we came on, Rabbi Dan and I were able to be talking about the danger of the algorithms that are being created. If you're sharing things that are pro-Israel and are really showing the real facts, not only does that change the algorithm for you, but it changed the algorithm for your followers and the people that you're engaged with also. So uplift the people that are really trying to educate those and uplift the, you know, the pros that we're seeing and what's really going on. Also encourage your schools to have robust anti-bias and Holocaust curriculums. I don't know if you know this, but it is actually required by law in the state of New Jersey to have Holocaust education in schools. And recently what we found was, and, you know, I'm very thankful to Governor Murphy and to others, that it's not only about having that education, but it's about having it be robust and successful. So they actually are now kind of looking at school curriculums to see how they can make it better. So encouraging your schools, and, you know, if you are interested, if your schools are already engaged in our programming or other anti-bias programming, feel free to contact me. I will share my contact information after, and I can connect you with members of our education team who, if they're not already engaged with the schools, would be happy to do so.
So before we open it up, just one other thing that I want to add to that, which is show up.
Yes.
Show up. Because the people who are standing against our community, they want to scare us off and they want us to not be together. Okay. It is an act of resistance to them that we show up. But in addition, I've heard this. I heard this from the teens. I've heard this from adults in the congregation. I've heard this from colleagues across the board. So many of us are feeling isolated and alone. And there is power in us being together. And even if you don't feel like you need to, for example, show up at services on a Friday night or a Saturday or whenever for something, you showing up may benefit the person sitting next to you and having you there. So keep showing up in record numbers, I would add.
And I would like to just point out, we've seen this. The other side is very organized. They have their numbers. They want us to be scared and to not do the same. So Rabbi Dan is absolutely right. Keep showing up. If they're pro-Israel rallies in your area, if they're, the vast amount of people that we saw in DC, it was so uplifting. But we need to continue to do this. We cannot take our foot off the gas in this moment.
Thanks, David. Wendy, do we have any questions?
We do. We have a lot of great questions. So the first question is kind of a broad question, but it interests, I think it would be good for everybody. How do we better manage the narrative that is being used to say that all Jews are responsible for the Palestinian deaths and labeling Israel as the aggressor while ignoring the horrors of October 7th?
So I think, this was one of the biggest fears that we had from the beginning, was that quickly the narrative was going to change because October 7th was going to happen. And we knew that Israel was going to have to respond. I think what we're seeing and what has been really amazing in terms of our elected officials and others is that they keep hammering in the free Palestine, but also free Palestine from Hamas and get our hostages home. One of the things that we see a lot is the hope for a ceasefire. We obviously all hope for a ceasefire, but there needs to be a ceasefire when Hamas is eliminated and when the hostages are home. I think one of the ways that we can counter this narrative is to educate ourselves, is to, make sure that we are up to date on exactly what is going on. And I would recommend, and there are certain, I try, I do watch the local news sources. I watch CNN, I watch MSNBC, I watch Fox, I watch all of them because it's good to know what everyone in mainstream media here is saying. But unfortunately, what we've seen, and I'm sure this comes to no surprise from you, that our media at home has been getting this wrong constantly, really, really often. And it's been really disheartening to see. So I recommend Times of Israel, I-24, Israeli news sources. Those are where you're going to get what really is going on so that you can educate yourselves and arm yourselves with information. So when you see someone saying X, you can respond with Y, with concrete facts. What I tell college students a lot of the time is when they are confronted with narratives of Israel as an apartheid state, Israel is committing genocide, they want you to get flustered. They want you to not be able to respond. If you can respond back with facts, nothing shuts someone up faster.
And if I can add to that, it's not just about Israel, right? It's not just about Israel. So I get back from the demonstration, 290,000 of us in person, 250,000 people online. And the New York Times says tens of thousands of Jews were in Washington. And I turn on MSNBC in the car. And at the end of the 9 o'clock hours, I'm driving home from the bus. I hear there was a demonstration in Washington today with signs saying, "Pave Gaza." Okay. I was there. David, you were there. It was loving. It was beautiful. It was supportive. It was solidarity. I'm sure there were a few outliers full of hate. They were the outliers, but the American media immediately picked up on the outliers because the outliers fit their narrative. Whereas 290,000 people and the police officers saying, I was given a year's worth of thank yous in 2 hours by the people who were here. That doesn't fit their narrative. We didn't have to clean up much because there wasn't a lot of litter. Doesn't fit their narrative. A couple of outlier hate signs did. So it's not just about Israel.
It's definitely, that's what they're going to pick up on in these moments. Yes, there are outliers here. There are people, we've seen it. There are people of our own communities that are calling for the death of all Palestinians, are using very hateful rhetoric. And unfortunately, because that is what sells, that's what's going to be what's propped up. And I think, unfortunately, that then even for us builds our own narrative in our head. Oh my God, there's so many hateful people out there. No, it's not true. And don't let social media and the media allow that narrative to be what you internalize.
Thank you. So the next question is kind of two parts. The argument that Israelis are racist against Palestinians, that they say bad things about Palestinians even pre-October 7th, or, you know, Israel is an imperfect country as an excuse to hold Israel to a higher standard. And somebody also, that's the first part. And the second part is somebody said that they've run into uninformed people who allege that ADL is racist and then refuse to listen to what ADL has to say.
Look, I think to answer the first question, I think like any country, Israel deals with its problems with racism and hate. But, to then say because the government is X, or there are people or there are certain members of society that have hate, that Israel shouldn't exist and should be held to a higher standard, is a form of anti-Semitism. We have issues in our own country. We have members of our own government that spew hate. No one is saying the United States of America should not exist. No one is holding our country to a higher standard than you would hold others because there is hate, and it shouldn't be the same here. And that is a form of anti-Semitism that we have. Double standards for Israel is a form of anti-Semitism. When we're talking about what's going on in Ukraine, no one is calling Ukraine to cease fire for the sake of ending this war. We've consistently seen it over and over again that Israel is going to continue to be held to a higher standard. And what we can do is fight back with that narrative and question, do you also then hold Iran to the same standards where their civilians are being targeted? Did you hold Syria to the same standards when their own government was gassing hundreds of thousands of their own people? Are you holding China to the same standards where they are putting the Uyghurs in legitimate concentration camps? And people then the whataboutism, and
there are currently 57 wars occurring in the world. 57 wars. Only one is getting discussed.
And I think you need to then point to, unfortunately, anti-Semitism. To answer your question about us, we unfortunately...
David, can I interrupt for a second? By the way, that was actually the question from the high schooler also. I didn't mention that, but it was that pointed. The kids came in with that concern also, believe it or not. How do we respond to this?
Fascinating, because we're an organization that does anti-bias work all the time. We not only respond to anti-Semitic incidents, but we respond to incidents of all hate. We were the only Jewish group asked to co-sponsor and march at the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. So to say that we are a racist organization means that people are just not paying attention and they haven't done their bare research. You could go on our website and look at the front page and look at one thing that is involved with our work with the Muslim community right now, which, I want to point out that Islamophobia is unfortunately also very much on the rise here. We saw 3 Palestinian students in Vermont targeted and shot because they were Palestinian this weekend. We saw a 6-year-old boy be killed because he was Muslim. And we are not going to stop protecting other groups because we are also being targeted at this time. And the best answer that you can give is that hate against one group never ends with just one group. And so to say that is absurd. And I would, again, I will, as part of these action items, I'm happy to send some of the work that we do with other groups also, so that if anyone says these questions, you can respond with X. The far left will always have an issue with us because we support Israel. It's been way before October 7th. That's been the issue. The far right will always have an issue with us because their feeling is we should only be focusing on anti-Semitism and Jews. And we are not going to change our values on either side based on extremists trying to counter us. It's never going to happen.
If I can add a little bit to that, what I I wish you had been there when we had the question from the high schoolers, because that was a great answer. Among the things that I said to them I said two other things, which was number one, ADL kind of holds up a mirror to certain people in groups, and nobody likes to be forced to look in the mirror. But the other piece is, and I do believe this is part of it, is that ADL is part of the guardrails for a civil society. And if you are one of the people or groups that are promulgating hatred in this way, you do not want those guardrails in place. You want to weaken those guardrails because it allows you to spew your hate and do what you're doing with greater ease and without consequence. And so if you can diminish the impact and the power and the influence of the ADL to doing what they're doing, it allows their hate to spread even more rapidly and more widely.
And I think what both sides also, just to add a little bit more, don't like is that we call on one side to call out the hate on that side. It's very easy for the right to call out hate on the left. It's very easy for the left to call out hate on the right. It's not easy to call out your own. And we have consistently taken the position of we cannot make effective change until, like you said, you can look at yourself in the mirror and be able to call out the hate that is coming from the people that you agree with on pretty much everything else.
Thank you. This question's for Rabbi Cohen. South Orange and Maplewood are probably the two most progressive communities in the state. The left has completely abandoned the Jewish community in the country, and South Orange and Maplewood are no different. Can you please talk about the anti-Semitism in the two towns? And then somebody else wrote, I'm seeing reports of anti-Semitic incidents in the elementary schools in South Orange. What can we do to address this? There you go.
And can you do it all in 15 seconds? We have challenges here for sure. We have an issue with from where I sit, we have an issue with the Mapso Freedom School, which is being discussed. And tomorrow night, there's actually a school board meeting where it's going to come up. The day after I was with the high school students, Rabbi True and I met for an hour with Principal Sanchez at the high school. I was actually texting with him over the weekend as well, because I do believe that at least on the school level, part of the issue is when there is a vacuum at the top and the top is not speaking strongly and taking clear, strong stances. And we have not seen enough of that. And to try to give him the tools and the encouragement and the kick in the behind to actually start doing that. So we're addressing that. We are very fortunate in South Orange. I've been on the phone multiple times over the last few weeks with Mayor Cullum, who is actually an incredible advocate of our community, and is very much very supportive. Mayor Daffis is as well. So from the elected official side, we are actually our towns are doing very well. On the school front, we have a lot of work to do, and we have an incredible group of engaged parents and clergy who are, I'm not going to say clergy, unfortunately, I'm going to say rabbis who are engaged with the schools and are working with them. But it takes time to do that, but we are engaged and we are working hard on this. We have some groups in the towns who are problematic. And the argument that I have now been trying to encourage people to make is, it is fine if you are Soma for Palestine, right? Or whatever their organization is. It is fine if you say we stand with Palestine. It is fine if you say we stand with the people of Gaza. That is appropriate. What is not appropriate is when you start using the tropes that David was talking about, which are hateful and ultimately call for our destruction, Israel's destruction and our deaths. That is not acceptable, but we're not going to be able to outshout them. We have to actually help other people become our allies and speak out and speak to this from a position of respect, aspirational. Again, it is one thing, as I've said to our high school kids last night, I said, if any of you put up a flyer or put something on social media that said, make Gaza Jewish again, you'd be dealing with me immediately, because that's not acceptable. I stand with Israel is different than that. And so we need to actually start talking, and David said it really well before, I think, which is we need to start distinguishing between what is free speech and what then becomes incitement and hate speech. and we need to call it out, but we need to not shout it out. We need to call it out, because we're not going to be able to outshout these folks. We can use our neighbors who care and have been too silent and get them to not be silent. We have to do that work. So I think things are challenging in these towns, but I don't think they're quite as challenging as sometimes we're led to believe they are. I think that we've got members of the Jewish community who are at both extremes, who are using rhetoric that's not necessarily helpful for our community whatsoever. And I have been trying to quietly encourage those on either side who are doing that to cut it out.
Next question, how is ADL, for you, David, how is ADL working with other Jewish organizations so that we have a formidable united front?
So I think, sometimes we can feel like we're all siloed in the work that we do. There is, I think, a little bit of level of competition when it comes to certain things. But I think October 7th has really, put us in a position of saying, we really need to unite here. So, we regularly work with organizations like AJC and the Brandeis Center when dealing with incidents on the ground in school settings. We put out joint statements. We put on, we speak on panels together. We, come to each other for advice on certain issues because we all understand that we have a shared goal. I think one of the best things that has been helpful for us is seeing religious leaders and CEOs and presidents of other major organizations, uplift the work of each other, because I think that is very important in this moment. But also, I think when it breaks down, it's, understanding that we have common goals here and understanding that we all have a role to play, which is why, I said things like ADL doesn't necessarily have the robust Israel education, but organizations like Stand With Us does. We're not afraid to point in the direction of our partners who have, the expertise in other areas, because right now it is so important to uplift all of the amazing work that we're all doing here and remain united. And it's why we're regularly, Rabbi Dan was talking about the Federation. I was on a call with someone that he knew today about an incident because, we needed the insight of each other to be able to help give advice to a Hillel director and students that are struggling, and knowing that it's not just about being the ones that be able to put out the statements first. It's about being able to be productive and being able to provide support in a moment that is so incredibly needed.
And David's saying this in a public facing setting. I want to kind of amplify that, because I actually was at lunch with a number of rabbis and our Federation CEO today with Dov Ben Shimon. And one of my colleagues asked a question about something. He said, you know what, I don't know the answer to that, but let me consult with AJC and the ADL, because they will have better insights. And we're on meetings weekly right now. That didn't happen before. In the same way that we're seeing that I'm on the phone with Rabbi Gewirtz, with Rabbi True, if not every day, every other day, right? We are all working together in new ways. And ultimately, it's good for the Jews. It's good for civilization. It's good for civility. It's good for our country, because we are the canary in the coal mine. And we are working together in far better ways than we ever have before. And I was happy to hear from Dov today and to hear from you, David, now that is really happening on the institutional level as well, because we need each other.
I have two last questions, if you're okay. You guys, everybody okay with two last questions? How has the other clergy, non-Jewish clergy, responded to their congregations or made any public statements? I know, Rabbi Cohen, you put out a whole piece on that. So let's start with David and then we'll come to Rabbi. David, have you felt the non-Jewish clergy have stood behind us?
Yeah, I absolutely have. And we, I know that we sit on a variety of different task forces that, not just Jewish leaders, but leaders of other communities that have really come out in full force in support of us, whether it just be reaching out right after October 7th to just, express condolences and offer whatever support they need, to being very vocal about their support of the Jewish community in Israel in this moment. I have absolutely felt that there has been a lot of show of solidarity from other faith leaders. With that being said, there can always be more. There can always be more support. And I think sometimes people feel like we've lost some of our allies, and it's not necessarily fully wrong. I do think that in some moments we have felt a little abandoned, but I also think that faith leaders have showed up in really, really amazing ways. And you can see no further than the vast amount of not just Jews that showed up in DC to show their support.
Rabbi?
Reverend Terry Richardson has been terrific.
Okay, that's that's it. Okay,
The silence has been stunning, and it's been across the board with all of my rabbinic colleagues reporting the same thing, and it's continued. Yes.
have you reached
That's
out?
and that
Have
is
you been able to reach out to them and see, you know?
I sent an email before we did the public op-ed. I sent an email to my Christian colleagues, and I basically said, we've stood together in these settings, and where are you now? Because we're hurting, we're scared, and we need you. And I got one response from someone which simply said, so I guess you're asking for a vigil, huh? That was the extent of it. So
so
the silence has been stunning.
I think, I think it's important to kind of differentiate between the national and local level. I
Yeah.
think local level, what Rabbi Cohen is describing is not necessarily foreign. I've heard from other faith leaders also who have kind of echoed the same thing. And I think sometimes now Jewish communities who have, supported so many other communities that we've seen through the Black Lives Matter protests around George Floyd, when the LGBTQ community is struggling, women's rights, so many other things that are just so important to our Jewish values. We've been there. And I think for a lot of people, they've felt abandoned. And that's not to say that we are going to stop using our Jewish values. And
That's exactly right. That's the point. But we may do it with different organizations. We shouldn't change who we are, but we need to change how we do it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
All right, final question. So these are scary times for all of us. Are we at pre-World War II Hitler times where we need to be afraid to continue to live in this country safely, in your opinion?
Absolutely not. I get a lot of questions of, should I stop wearing my Jewish star in public? For men who wear yarmulkes, should I stop wearing my kippah in public? No, that's exactly what the other side wants. They want us to be afraid to show our identity and Jewish pride. If anything, now it's time to double down on our Jewish pride. It's time for us to be absolutely proud and be very openly and outwardly proud to be Jewish. I do not think that we are in danger. Look, we should be vigilant. We should be prepared. We should be aware of what's going on. But no, I do not believe it is not safe to be Jewish in this country in 2023.
Rabbi, I'll let you have the last word.
I think it is a very personal question. The answer to it is very personal. And I think people need to honor their comfort levels or not. Look, we have a flag in our window. We have a flag in our window. And when I went to Israel, we took it down because if something happened, I didn't want Raina to have to deal with it alone, and we'll deal with it together. I do think that we have to be vigilant. I think vigilance is the right word. I think if somebody is not comfortable wearing overt symbols of their Jewishness right now, I certainly don't sit in judgment of that whatsoever. But I do think that there are other ways to actually show our solidarity and our Jewishness, and that's by showing up at things, being present. But I also think we need to be smart. So, for example, I don't think anybody should walk down a dark street alone anyway, under normal circumstances. But right now, I think how much the more so, I wouldn't necessarily walk down the street, a dark street, with a kippah on right now in a place that I don't know. Right? But that probably is not a bad practice, even under the best of times. So I think we need to all use our best judgment. I think there are major differences between now and then. One of them is, and I'm going to be honest, one of them is, and it's not just because David's here, is that we have organizations like the ADL. We have a structure for dealing with this. We we're not ready for the onslaught of this after October 7th of the hate that came out, which has taken us some time to ramp up. But we now have legal action being taken against those who are actually not doing the right thing, who have taken our community's safety for granted. We have a president currently, regardless of your politics, this president has been clear about his Israel policy, has been clear about how he stands with the Jewish community. We are the only issue in this country that is currently that crosses the aisle.
Yes.
There are no other issues that are bipartisan anymore, right? And so, and there may be some reasons for some of the bipartisanship that the reasons for them don't make me 100% comfortable, but I'll take the bipartisan support right now. So that is vastly different. But I do think that if we're not vigilant, we could find ourselves in great danger, which is why it is important. And I'm going to shill now for ADL. Not just because I know and like David and his father's a friend, and because Raina works for the ADL, but we as a congregation need to once again be one of the biggest turnouts that never is now. I was texting with Heather earlier. I want to find the funding. I want to find the donors to actually have every one of our high school kids who come be able to invite one of their non-Jewish friends to come with them. I want to talk at Heather's suggestion. I'm giving the credit where credit's due. We say B'Shem Amro, we cite things in the name of the person, to talk with the principal and to get him to make them excused absences or school days for the kids. We need to show up. We need to keep educating ourselves. We need to stay involved, because part of the solution to this is us. And David, I know how busy all of you at ADL are, and you taking this time. I am deeply grateful for it. As always, and for your leadership and for all that you're doing for our community and for the type of country that we all want to live in and want to actually leave to the next generation. So thank you for everything you're doing. And to Wendy and Tracy, you both are amazing, and I just am grateful to you both.
Thank you,
so much.
everybody. Thanks, David, and thank you, Rabbi Cohen.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.